some of what quite a bit of what I'll be doing will overlap with something I did about 5 years ago, which was more looking at fascism and then touching on totalitarianism. So I'm not going to be talking about totalitarianism and as much about Stalinism, but there will be a little bit of overlap if you can still remember that from 5 years ago. I think first it's worth thinking about what the difference is between the totalitarian moment or impulse and, if you like, straightforward dictatorship or authoritarianism. So when a dictatorship restricts or crushes freedom and autonomy, it does not traditionally seek to abolish its basis in the autonomous individual and various sort of differentiation insights arising from that on the whole. The totalitarian moment or impulse that I'm going to be talking about seeks to change the nature of man's soul, if you like, in the sense of crushing or abolishing the basis for autonomy itself. So the mission of the totalitarian is to eliminate the role of freedom by assaulting the boundaries, the exercise of self-interest, the premise of autonomy, and the differentiation of individuals, classes, or nations from the mass. We'll talk about the mass in a bit. In the 1930s, it emerged as the driving force in Nazi Germany, emulating and outstripping Stalinism, which had adopted the mission in Stalin's attempts to transform the Bolshevik Party in Soviet state with new dynamics that could dissolve an already fragile order to replace it with something new. By doing so, he imbued the Soviet Union with a new energy, a new motion that was taken up by the Nazis as an organising model that, unlike in Russia, was harnessed to one of the world's most powerful economies and modern states, unleashing unprecedented destruction and horror in the Holocaust, which I'm not going to talk about, but we've talked about before, the difference in the character between the Holocaust and, let's say, the people who died during collectivization, the Soviet Union, etc. I'm going to look at some of those dynamics and attempts to break down autonomous life, and occasionally I'm going to lean, and I don't make any apology for it, on literature, because it really is literature which frequently came into direct conflict with the totalitarian moment, and I think often best expresses the essence of the impulse. Because actually, curiously, there are very few theorists of totalitarianism, which that becomes apparent later on. So first I want to set the scene in history, in the wider moment and the crisis in the identity of the individual and society that followed the First World War in Western Europe, with a turning away from liberalism and democracy that led to a profound crisis of authority and the state, providing a fertile soil for the germ of the totalitarian idea to germinate. The germ of the totalitarian idea is all very, very much present in elite thinking of the intelligentsia. I mean, look at John Kerry's Intellectuals and the Masses to sort of prove that, if you like. So first I'll look at the West and the rise, or Europe and the West and the rise of fascism and Nazism, which reflecting Germany's importance quickly dominated. Secondly, in the Soviet Union, I'll look at the bureaucratic and authoritarian degeneration of the revolution and the rise of Stalin, but again, very briefly. This really is a spring. It's difficult to understate the profound disorientation, the loss of the sense of self, the sense of disorder and crisis, with a severing between the links between past, present and future that followed the Great War, and the febrile sense that new energies and antagonisms and destructive potential, positive potential had been unleashed. And D.H. Lawrence's novel, Lady Chatterley's Lover, is notable not just for its pornography, but in terms of exploring the sort of psychological and social effects of the war and the despair of what he describes in that novel as an essentially tragic age. So the novel opens with: the cataclysm has happened, we are among the ruins. We start to build up new little habitats, to have new little hopes. It is rather hard work. There is now no smooth road into the future, but we go round or scramble over the obstacles. We have got to live no matter how many skies have fallen. So combined with a sense of trauma, there is this re-evaluation and lowering of expectations and a rethinking of the basis of the liberal idea that saw politics and representative parliamentary government as resulting or arising from the rational playing out of interests pursued by autonomous individuals allied with others in classes or differentiated groups based on their interests and self-interest. The 1920s framed a decade that would be defined by a European movement against democracy, one that was often heroically resisted, and it's very important to know that actually the 30s ended in defeat, but in many ways it was an optimistic decade which has a lot to be said for it in terms of music and literature, the best literature of the 20th century, I think. So there's a lot of potential there as well. So we tend to view the 1930s as being this inevitable defeat. But anyway, so there was this European movement against democracy, or towards dictatorship or anti-democratic rule based on new ideas of society that could no longer rely on tradition, which was totally wounded in the war, and assumed new motivations for society and individuals that were seen as essentially irrational. Robert O. Paxton, the historian of fascism, and I think the best in the game, noted that it was a liberal Europe itself that had violated all its own principles by letting itself be swept into the barbarity of a long war which it was then incapable of managing. If you look at the collapse of the crisis of social democracy following the First World War, and when I'm talking about liberal, I mean the Social Democrats essentially. Contrary to myth, fascists never seized power or won power via democratic elections. Fascists and the Nazis entered into highly pragmatic alliances with sections of existing state elites in the disorder and chaos, including acute political conflict. There was a need for disorientated state elites to build new relationships with society, to move away from the idea of self-determined interests, liberalism, to a new politics of mass, which again, more of which later. So was it inevitable? Many pessimistic readings of the period imply it was. That tends to be how we view the 1930s. Paxton, in fact, argues that it was not. He says there was nothing inevitable about the arrival of Mussolini and Hitler in office, again, locate the problem in a crisis of liberalism and the rejection by conservatives on the right of the democratic movement. So the attachment to democracy, its basis in freedom, a self-determined realm of interests, often weak, broke down before fascism or Nazism, heralding a new order. The profound disenchantment with a democracy that linked the realm of political, as the clash of interests, to representative institutions that saw themselves as being able to represent the national or the public interest is illustrated by many liberal thinkers of the period. And I just do this quote, and I use it from time to time. Joseph Schumpeter, in his very influential 1942 book, Capitalism, Socialism and Democracy, and he advocated technocracy to save the West, but even he identifies this problem with the autonomous individual, even though he's trying to defend democracy and social democracy. We remain under the practical necessity of attributing to the individual independence and rational quality that is altogether unrealistic, he wrote. It must not be forgotten that the phenomena of crowd psychology are by no means confined to mobs rioting in the narrow streets of a Latin town. Every parliament displays, in however mild a form, some of those features. In particular, a reduced a level of responsibility, a lower level of energy of thought, and greater sensitiveness to non-logical influences. So with friends like that, who needs enemies? The door was open to totalitarians who sought to recast society on the premise the autonomous, rational individual is a myth, a dangerous myth, a construct that needed to be rebuilt on a more realist basis, reflecting the irrational, lower energy of thought and greater sensitiveness of non-logical influences. And as Schumpeter illustrates, the rationale of this tendency was very dominant in elite and intellectual thought. In Russia, also ravaged by war, civil war, disorder and social breakdown, the Soviet Revolution, an initially progressive and democratic event, struggled to survive, degenerating within 5 years. So the Bolsheviks had taken power in a huge territory where a despotic and centralised Tsarist bureaucracy governed a fairly structureless population, mainly of landless peasants, a society that a very weak, embryonic urban capitalist class had not yet organised. The leadership of the small working class was also decimated in the civil war that followed the revolution, and the early democratic principles of the Bolsheviks were rapidly subsumed to expediency, the struggle to survive, and the fusing of the revolutionary party with elements of the existing state bureaucracy. And one of the interesting aspects of this moment was Lenin's attempts to introduce differentiations into a Soviet society in terms of trying to create new classes, trying to discover new nations. So Arendt notes he was more frightened by the absence of social and other structure than by the possible development of centrifugal tendencies in the newly emancipated nationalities, or even the growth of a new bourgeoisie out of the newly established middle and peasant classes. So even though Lenin and many in the Bolshevik leadership failed to resist the merging of supreme state power with the party bureaucracy, this development, the rise of tyranny and dictatorship, revolutionary dictatorship, would not have necessarily led to totalitarianism. That wasn't a given. That was to come with Stalin. So in fact, a new state class or caste added to the developing social stratification in Russia, alongside a politically diminished and present working class, peasantry, and new middle class out of the new economic policy, could have stabilised a revolutionary dictatorship. So Stalin's rise to power sought to change the basis of our embryonic new form of class system or Soviet society, or the system of Soviet national republics, by tearing down the differentiation of the nations and classes Lenin had tried to cohere. So first he cemented Bolshevik control of power by dissolving the Soviets. Then he moved to liquidate classes, with the most striking and brutal development being the expropriation of the kulaks, the rich peasants, forced collectivization of agriculture using artificial famine and deportations as a weapon, killing millions. What remained of the working class suffered innovations such as the Stakhanov system to break up class consciousness. The labour was militarised, and there was formations of new aristocracy in the workplace, and the party penetrated the workplace too. And then finally for Stalin, from 36 to 38, he instigated this new internal regime of purges and terror within the Bolsheviks, sweeping out, exiling, imprisoning or executing 50% of the party, so again millions of people. And this is interesting because none of these amazing developments that Stalin unleashed was really motivated by any traditional sort of authoritarian or dictatorial impulse, because none of these social strata that he liquidated were actually hostile to the regime. So it's very important to note that Stalinism prepared its ground by, it's also very important to note that Stalinism prepared its ground by exterminating, literally exterminating, a layer of individuals, revolutionaries, and some really, truly outstanding people who'd been forged in the life of arguing, testing, building relationships, of class politics, leading to the high level of historical consciousness that had created the Russian Revolution. So he was, of course, killing the men and women in an international movement who could have mounted a challenge to Hitler and fascism, tipping the balance in Germany, arguably, and certainly in Spain, where Stalin was the gravedigger of democracy alongside Franco. So having set the scene, I just want to look at some of the key features of a totalitarian assault on freedom, and an order built on freedom, democracy, which came through transformation the transformation into classes of self-determined interests rooted in the autonomous individual, transformed into mass, an undifferentiated, structureless, atomized, lonely multitude of isolated people. And if you want to get a sense of what it was like in Nazi Germany, the Fallader's famous book Alone in Berlin, I mean, it gives you that mood, that feeling of what it was like to be mass bound. So the onslaught took the form of a permanently organised, so dynamic assault on the boundaries and the autonomous from state authority, self-determined spheres in which individuals differentiate themselves to pursue interests, including, and really importantly, including hitherto non-political areas of life, from the family to intimacy and science to arts and the literature. So, as I said earlier, the idea or germ of mass was present and emerged in particularly the imperialist elites in the late 19th century as a reaction against the modern world. And as John Carey notes in his book, Intellectuals and the Masses, he notes it as a linguistic device. Its function as a linguistic device is to eliminate the human status of the majority of people, to deprive them of those distinctive features that make users of the term, in their own esteem, superior. So this dystopian view of an undifferentiated mass of individuals, largely determined by irrational psychological drives, already developed into a science of behavioural crowd psychology and advertising, formed the existing basis, the germ of a totalitarian mission to build an alternative modernity based on a new kind of individual. So in that sense, totalitarians took up, or the wider appeal of totalitarianism, both in its Stalinist form outside Russia, particularly in countries like Britain, was because it built on an already strong, even dominant tendency in the intelligentsia to recast society, to break down individuals and classes as a means to that end. So the totalitarian impulse was to obliterate the foundational basis, regarded by distaste by even its defenders like Schumpeter, of a liberal representative democratic politics, to destroy the basis of class and, as we'll see, nation as well, which is not a structureless mass, but the self-articulation of interests organised by self-determining individuals who autonomously enter into alliances that differentiate society and the world and territories through nations, etc. So Arendt, with a nice insight into masses, noted that masses are not held together by a consciousness of common interest, and they lack that specific class articulateness which is expressed in determined, limited and obtainable goals, and it's determined, limited and attainable goals. It's very important to hold that definition. So mass politics grew out of societies fragmented, highly atomised, either by Stalin's counter-revolution or the chaos of war and almost civil war in Germany. So the competitive, sort of divisive, atomising structures of capitalist and imperialist societies, and the loneliness, if you like, of the individual had been held in check through the membership of classes, or through their membership of these differentiating, self-determining stratas. Alfred Rosenberg, a Nazi theorist and senior party official, puts it, the individualistic doctrine which teaches that the individual creature exists of himself has collapsed. So Arendt and other writers of the period, from Koestler to Orwell to Fallada, and actually a lot of the sort of crowd psychology people, note this sort of weakening of self-preservation, which we're going to come back to, particularly in layers of the intelligentsia that had previously fought for freedom but sought to abdicate autonomy, and just think of some of those sort of former sort of Bolshevik militants, and we'll come to them shortly. So the chief characteristic of mass man, said Arendt, isn't brutality and backwardness, but his isolation and lack of normal social relationships. So individuals exercising autonomy, self-interest and freedom have a tendency to differentiate themselves. So they create spheres of life, distinction between public and private, and in many instances, particularly in areas of life that were not previously subject to political regulation, they're very important realms in which people sort of constitute or renew themselves. You know, they're a haven from the sort of sharp elbows of daily life. So the exercise of freedom creates new strata, new ties, new associations of people. It can be around religion, art, culture, elements of the imagination that take place for their own sake, chess playing, stamp collecting, with non-political rules and norms that are of equal importance to constituting the autonomous individual as the pursuit of conventional material self-interest. Really importantly, and this is really picked up in particularly in literature, because writers were part of the intelligentsia, the transmission belt for this assault on the ties of class, nation, art, family, was the intelligentsia, the educated middle class on the whole, through the party, whether it was the National Socialist Party or the Stalinised Communist parties. So Nazis, quickly adopting Stalin's model, organised Germany at work or home around party front organisations married to German state structures such as the police, social workers and the medical profession. Now, atomisation, the model the Nazis were following to create this mass, this undifferentiated mass in Soviet society, came through the use of repeated political purges and purges that would come before the murder, the liquidation of individuals or groups, and always generated this quite dynamic and perpetual sense of insecurity and isolation. The arbitrariness and even the wanton destruction of these purges, that it, for example, crippled the Soviet Union military in the run-up to the German invasion in 1941, was combined with astonishing violence. It was completely unchecked, deliberately brutal, and entirely outside of any kind of judicial or public presence. It was real fear. I mean, this was the real thing. If you're afraid nowadays. And I think Arendt, again, says it best, although, read Vasily Grossman's Life and Fate, which is one of the best novels of the 20th century set in totalitarian Russia, many of Victor Serge's novels, Kirsten's Darkness at Noon, and of course Orwell's absolutely brilliant 1984, that paint this picture. So I'll just quote at length, because I think she just gets it just gets it absolutely right. So in order to destroy all social and family ties, the purges are conducted in such a way to threaten with the same fate the defendant and all his ordinary relations, from mere acquaintances up to his closest friends and relatives. The consequences of a simple ingenious device of guilt by association is that as soon as a man is accused, his former friends are transformed immediately into his bitterest enemies. In order to save their own skins, they volunteer information and rush in with denunciations to corroborate the non-existent evidence against him. This, obviously, is the only way to prove their own trustworthiness. Retrospectively, they will try and prove that their acquaintance or friendship with the accused was only a pretext for spying on him and revealing him as a saboteur, a Trotskyite, a foreign spy, or a fascist, and you can just adjust the epithets the other way around for the Nazis. So merit is then gauged by the number of your denunciations of close comrades, even if they're not acted on. It is obvious that the most elementary portion demands that one avoid all intimate contacts, if possible, not in order to prevent discovery of one's secrets force, but rather to eliminate, in the almost certain case of future trouble, all persons who might not only have an ordinary cheap interest in your denunciation, but an irresistible need to bring about your ruin, simply because they are in danger of their own lives. So in the last analysis, it's been through the development of this device to its farthest and most fantastic extreme that the Soviet rulers have succeeded in creating this anatomized and individualized society, the like of which we've never seen before, and which events or catastrophes alone can hardly brought about. And you transfer that into the German situation. So by the end of, by the high point at the beginning of the Second World War, the Nazis controlled Berlin with actually less police than they'd had at the beginning of the, because of the police were off doing other stuff. But like the days of people in Eastern Europe. But so this was it worked. It worked as a model. And most, I suppose, distressing was the embrace of this, particularly by Bolsheviks, this horrible, abasing, degrading, destructive environment. So men and women who'd once rebelled, led revolutions, strikes, written books, and had often remained steadfast in the face of conventional tyranny. I mean, he literally abased themselves. So Rubishov's diary in Kursla's Darkness at Noon expresses this sort of horrible destination for millions of progressives and militants who fought for freedom but ended up embracing ignominy before death. So he writes in his fictional diary, this old Bolshevik, "We admitted no private sphere, not even inside a man's skull. As the only moral criterion which we recognise as that of social utility, the public disavowal of one's conviction in order to remain in the party ranks is obviously more honourable than the quixotism of carrying on a hopeless struggle. Questions of personal pride, prejudices such as exist elsewhere against certain forms of self-abasement, personal feelings of tiredness, disgust and shame are to be cut off root and branch." So you go from the militant heroism of class struggle to this, abasement. I mean, the lowest you can go. And really, to conclude, I want to very, very briefly look at how the Nazis and the Bolsheviks abandoned any definite aims. So the Nazis abandoned the idea of the salvation of the German nation, and the Bolsheviks, the Stalinized Bolsheviks, abandoned any program related to working class power for very ill-defined, ahistorical, millennial objectives that were not linked to the past or present in terms of a reality of any experience. So the war to atomise society into a mass meant that both the Stalinists and the Nazis abandoned political programs, economic efficacy, or even recognition of natural laws. And if you look at some of the devastation unleashed in the sort of 2 + 2 = 5 world of Soviet production, or the disorganisation of Germany's war effort at key moments by the resources put into the Holocaust, of course you can see that sort of slipping the leash of reality. So most significantly, it meant that the Nazis abandoned the idea of the German nation as it actually existed or was constituted, and the Stalinists, using formulations already developed by the Bolshevik dictatorship and people such as Trotsky, moved away from a program of working class power or socialism to channeling the power of history that existed and worked itself out independently of existing human beings. So one of the, I find this absolutely fascinating aspect of the Nazis was once they assumed power, was their increasingly anti-German dynamic in the sense of tearing down and abandoning the concept of a nation or national mission that applied to any past or present reality of German people. So the original idea of Volksgemeinschaft, or sort of people's community, German people's community, obviously, was quickly overtaken by an open contempt for Germans once the Nazis were in power. So Hitler very often made the point that Nazism would transcend the narrow limits of modern nationalism. In 1923, he said the German people consists for 1/3 of heroes, for another third of cowards, while the rest are traitors. Goebbels asked in 1934, who are the people to criticise? Party members? No. The rest of the German people? They should consider themselves lucky to be alive. In 1943, obviously things weren't going well anyway, instructions from the SS headquarters in Berlin forbade the use of the word nation in any National Socialist documents. The link between the nation as a community of living individuals with a past and present was dismissed, so Himmler would repeatedly insist that he and the SS worked with a future that began not in years but in millennia. It was measured not in years but in millennia. Really importantly, in Nazi Germany, anti-Semitism was not merely the persecution and later extermination of Jews, but was used as a solvent to break down German society, class and rank, down into mass, particularly for bourgeoisie. So the whole point was that every citizen, every German, had to prove they weren't a Jew. The definitions would be constantly changed, sometimes following secret degrees. So you'd move house, you'd have to get a new residence permit, and you discovered that your old bit of paper saying that you're an heir and no longer applied. You had to go back and work out more distantly, looking at your grandmothers. So no one could be sure from one year to the next whether or not they would be found to be Jewish. It's so arbitrary. In the higher ranks of the SS, Himmler's scientific approach was to just look at a photograph. If he liked them, they were in, they were there, and if he didn't, well, they were subhuman. So again, it's looking at Hitler's plans for Germany after the war, which is in various directives and speeches. So it wasn't only the Jews and inferior peoples, such as the Slavs, that were to be exterminated, to preserve and make room for the Aryan race, which isn't at all the same as the Volksgemeinschaft, but many Germans too were going to be targeted as part of a much broader, quote, negative population policy. And as Himmler always emphasised, in this process of selection there can never be a standstill. So basically Germans are going to move on to isolate and liquidate all families with cases of heart or lung disease. So to obliterate the autonomous individual in Germany, particularly as a national socialist movement, the Nazis had to attack the idea of the nation because it is too historically bound up or contaminated in their view with the idea of the self-determination, of a differentiation made by a community of individuals working out their interests on their territory. And similarly, this really is the end, Stalin, while dissolving Lenin's attempts to differentiate the mass of Russian society by fostering national and class differences, together leverage, if you like, had to drop any semblance of previous Bolshevik programs. Instead, he had no program at all, with the argument ready to hand from the old guard that his new order was channeling historical forces to act above, beyond and behind the backs of socialist programs, morality or autonomy. We argued, Trotsky, who's talking about the Bolsheviks, including the Stalinists, learned the rhythm of history. Learned, it seems, and to a certain degree successfully, how to subordinate our subjective plans and programs to this objective rhythm. They learn not to fall into despair over the fact that the laws of history do not depend upon their individual tastes and are not subordinated to their own moral criteria. People dance to the tune of history that's playing them like a fiddle. So finally, the totalitarian moment or impulse wasn't merely an exercise in traditional tyranny or authoritarianism, but sought to break down these relationships, to assault sovereignty and independence at the level of the nation, class, and the individual. And by trying to destroy these boundaries of freedom, they were essentially attacking what makes us human. So our self-determined differentiation from everyone else as autonomous individuals is very much part of that project of being human.